The walls of the royal palace in Belgrade seemed to tremble with a mother's rage. The argument was not merely loud, it was desperate. Dowager Queen Natalia was pleading, demanding, screaming at her son, the young King Alexander, the last scion of the Obrenovich dynasty. The main argument, hurled like a stone, was simple and brutal. His chosen one was an old woman, incapable of giving Serbia an heir. And without an heir, the dynasty was doomed to oblivion. But if the palace echoed with desperate pleas, the whispers on the streets of Belgrade were far more venomous. The word on the street, holding nothing back, painted the future queen in the foulest of colors. They said her reputation was hopelessly tarnished, her past far too rich with male attention. They recalled her mother, a woman with a tragic past and a ruinous addiction whose life had ended in an asylum. With hatred, they mentioned her power-hungry brothers, ready to sink their claws into the throne through their sister. Picture the scene. On one side, a private tragedy, the cry of a mother terrified for the future of her line. On the other, a roar of public contempt, a toxic blend of truth, lies, and outright slander. And at the center of this storm stood a young, inexperienced, and as many called him, strange king who had dared to love. But the most terrifying thing for the court and the government was that behind the thick smoke of these rumors and exaggerations, a real fire burned. To understand the full scale of the tragedy that would unfold in Serbia, we must go back in time, to the moment when this small Balkan nation, having thrown off the centuries-old Ottoman yoke, proudly proclaimed itself a kingdom. The year was 1882, and Milan Obrenović, a man as brilliant and educated as he was deeply contradictory, ascended to the throne. From the very beginning, his reign was like a tightrope walk over an abyss, while his family life devolved into a separate, far more spectacular and scandalous theater. His wife, Natalia Keshko, the daughter of an Odessa landowner, was a domineering, proud, and no less ambitious woman. Theirs was a marriage of convenience that quickly became a battlefield for two incompatible personalities and political ideologies. Milan leaned towards Austria-Hungary. Natalia's heart was entirely with Russia. Their quarrels, infidelities, and public humiliations became a legend not only in Belgrade, but in every European capital. It was in this atmosphere of mutual hatred that their only child, the heir to the throne, Alexander, was raised. Imagine a boy whose home was not a fortress, but a perpetual front line. His parents, consumed by their own wars, used him as a weapon against each other, as the final trump card in their endless game of grievances. He grew up a sickly, withdrawn, and frighteningly serious child, deprived of simple warmth and affection. Contemporaries and later historians would call him a strange one. But what lay behind that word? Not madness, but a deep psychological trauma, an emotional hunger that would haunt him for his entire life. He was a crown prince whom others envied, but in his soul he remained a lonely boy, desperately searching for love and stability in a world that, from his birth, had offered him only chaos. This chaos reached its zenith in 1889. King Milan, utterly exhausted by political intrigue, military defeats, and his personal hell, committed an act that stunned all of Europe. He abdicated, not in favor of a strong successor, but in favor of his 13-year-old fragile and completely unprepared son. Thus, Alexander Obrenović before he even had a chance to grow up, became a boy king, a plaything in the hands of a regency council. This council, of course, included his mother, Queen Natalia. But instead of protecting her son, she continued her war, now against the other regions. The political life of Serbia became an endless struggle for influence over the young monarch. He was a king in name only, a pawn on a chessboard, moved by anyone who pleased. For 4 years, he endured this humiliating position. Then at 17, the strange little boy showed his teeth. In April 1893, he staged his first coup d'etat. Inviting the regents and ministers to dinner, he, with the support of loyal officers, declared them arrested, and himself the sole and rightful ruler of age. It was a bold and desperate move, an attempt to wrench his life and his country from the hands of others. But in seizing power, he was confronted with a chilling loneliness. He realized he could not manage without support, and so he made another unpredictable move. A year later, he summoned his exiled father Milan back to Serbia. The son had hoped for an advisor and a pillar of support, but what he got was a calculating politician who immediately took control of the army and began to effectively rule the country from behind the king's back. Milan's return meant one thing: the total defeat of Queen Natalia, who was now definitively pushed from power. His father, having reclaimed his influence, immediately turned to the most pressing matter of state: finding a bride for his son. This was not a whim, but a political necessity. The Obrenović dynasty was young and not particularly prestigious. It could not compare to the centuries-old Habsburgs or Hohenzollerns. The right marriage could strengthen Serbia's position on the international stage and, most importantly, give the country stability and an heir. Milan began a veritable casting call across the courts of Europe. After a long search, the choice fell upon a German princess, Alexandra of Schaumburg-Lippe. Her candidacy was, to be frank, a compromise. The bride possessed neither great beauty nor wealth, nor a famous name, but she was German, which satisfied the pro-Austrian faction, and crucially, she was young and healthy. It seemed the dynasty's fate was sealed, and Serbia was heading for a predictable, if dull, future. Everything was in place for the official announcement of the engagement, and it was at that exact moment that the young King Alexander, the quiet and obedient son, delivered a blow that stunned them all. He announced that he had already found a wife, himself, and this woman had nothing in common with European princesses. The woman's name was Draga. In Serbian history, her name would become synonymous with fatal passion and the fall of a dynasty. Her enemies and popular rumor would turn her into a demonic figure, a cunning seductress, almost a witch who destroyed a naive king. But behind this caricature lay a life filled with humiliation, despair, and brief, desperate attempts to break free from the grip of circumstance. To understand her, we must forget the crown for a moment and look inside the modest house where she was born. She was the 6th of 7 children born to the family of a district chief, Ponteliha Lunjevica. Her grandfather had been a respected merchant, a man of substance and wealth. But by the time of Draga's birth, the family's financial situation had already faltered. Her father was an honest man, but not a particularly successful one, and a large family demanded constant expense. Even the date of her birth would become a weapon in the hands of her detractors. Officially, she was born in 1866, but when Draga drew close to the throne, her enemies, eager to emphasize her improper age for a queen, would gleefully cite other dates, 1864 and even 1860. It was as if they were trying to age her retroactively, turning her into a woman of no specific age, or rather, an age that was always her primary crime in the eyes of a patriarchal society. A shadow was also cast over the family by the tragic fate of her mother, Anna. The woman suffered from a mental illness aggravated by alcoholism, and her life's journey ended within the walls of an asylum. This fact would become another nail hammered into her daughter's reputation. Bad blood, they whispered, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Despite all these hardships, Draga was no simpleton or uneducated provincial. On the contrary, she received one of the best educations available to a woman of her time, graduating from the prestigious Higher Women's Institute in Belgrade. She knew several foreign languages, including Russian and French, was passionate about history and literature, was a fine writer herself, and even tried her hand at translation. This was an intelligent, well-read, and undoubtedly ambitious young woman who envisioned a very different future for herself. But harsh reality put everything in its place. By the time Draga turned 17, her father's finances had completely collapsed. He was on the brink of bankruptcy, and the fate of his unmarried daughters hung by a thread. In such a situation, marriage is not a choice of the heart, but a transaction born of desperation. And her marriage was precisely such a transaction. A groom was found quickly. He was Svetozar Mashin, a mining engineer from Bohemia, a man 12 years Draga's senior. He had money and status, but he also had a reputation. He suffered from a weakness for drink, and no respectable family was eager to give him their daughter. But Draga's father, Panteliha, no longer had a choice. He gave his young, educated, and beautiful daughter to an older and not particularly pleasant man to save the family from the shame of poverty. One can only guess what the 17-year-old girl felt entering this marriage of convenience. All her dreams of a brilliant future, of self-fulfillment, of love, collapsed in an instant. The marriage lasted only 3 years and was, by all accounts, joyless. Her husband continued to drink, and his health rapidly declined. In 1886, his journey came to an end. Svetozar Mashin passed away from the consequences of an epileptic seizure brought on by his ruinous habit. At 20, Draga was left alone, young, beautiful, but utterly penniless. From her brief marriage, she inherited nothing but the status of a widow and the surname Mashin, which would now become both her stigma and her ticket to a different, far more dangerous and dazzling life in the high society of Belgrade. She returned to the world not as a naive girl, but as a woman who had known humiliation, despair, and had learned to survive at any cost. Returning to her parents' home, Draga Mashin found herself in a position that could be described in one word: an abyss. Her father had by then passed away, leaving behind a trail of debts. The young widow, barely 20, was left without money, without protection, and with a surname that meant nothing. In the patriarchal Serbia of the late 19th century, there were few paths for a woman in her situation, and all of them led downwards. But Draga was forged from a different metal. Within her burned not just a survival instinct, but a cold, calculating will to live, multiplied by a sharp intellect and a brilliant education. She was not about to surrender. At first, she tried to rely on her talents. Her knowledge of languages and her fine prose allowed her to take up translation and journalism. She wrote articles for magazines, translated novels, and moved in the literary and artistic circles of Belgrade. This was her official, respectable life. But the fees for such work were meager and irregular, barely allowing her to make ends meet. Far more, it was whispered in the salons, came from other, less advertised activities. The capital was rife with rumors of her numerous affairs. However, to reduce her role to that of a mere mistress to wealthy patrons would be a gross oversimplification. Draga was not just a beautiful woman. She was a brilliant conversationalist, intelligent and perceptive. Her salon, if one could call her modest drawing room that, became a magnet for writers, journalists, opposition politicians, and ambitious officers. Here, in an atmosphere of freewheeling conversation, she was not an object of desire, but a full-fledged player. She knew how to listen, how to ask the right questions, how to keep others' secrets, and how to share the right information at the right moment. Her connections with influential men, many of whom were married, gave her not only money, but something far more valuable: information and influence. She was a barometer of Belgrade's political life. It was this very reputation as an intelligent, dangerous, free, and available woman that simultaneously opened some doors for her while slamming others shut. She became what the French call a demi-mondaine, a woman of the half-world, balancing on the fine line between aristocratic salons and outright bohemia. And it was this reputation, which she herself had crafted for survival, that would become her curse. At this very time, far from Serbia, Queen Natalia languished in exile. After her son, King Alexander, had allowed her hated husband Milan back into the country, her position had become unbearable. She was forced to leave Belgrade and settled in Biarritz, a fashionable resort town on the Atlantic coast of France. Here, in a luxurious villa named Sascino, in honor of her son, she created a semblance of her own court in exile. Surrounded by a few loyal ladies-in-waiting and guests, she lived on memories of past glory and plotted her revenge. And then, by a twist of fate, the paths of these two women, the exiled queen and the scandalous widow, crossed. A mutual acquaintance recommended Draga Mašin to Queen Natalia. The candidate was perfect. Draga was educated, fluent in French, and came from a good but impoverished family, which meant she was completely dependent and posed no threat. So Draga left dusty, intrigue-filled Belgrade and found herself in the glittering but no less venomous atmosphere of Biarritz. She became a lady-in-waiting, a companion, almost a shadow to Queen Natalia. She read aloud to her, handled her correspondence, and accompanied her on walks. Over these years, she learned a great deal from her patroness. She absorbed the manners of high society, acquired a European Polish, and learned to navigate the complex intricacies of court etiquette and backroom intrigues. Queen Natalia, without realizing it, was with her own hands polishing a rough diamond into a brilliant that would soon blind her own son. It was during this period that a legend was born, one that Draga's enemies would later repeat with relish, that she had once been young Alexander's governess. This was an outright lie. designed to make their future relationship seem even more monstrous in the eyes of society. The age difference between them was only 10 years, and they met when Alexander was no longer a boy, but a young king. Their fateful meeting took place in 1895. The young King Alexander, weary of his father's total control and the political battles in Belgrade, decided to visit his mother in Biarritz. Perhaps it was a gesture of reconciliation, or perhaps simply a desire to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the Serbian capital. He arrived on the Atlantic coast, 20 years old, awkward, suffering from severe nearsightedness and an all-consuming loneliness. And then one day, during a walk on the beach, an incident occurred that legend has transformed into an act of heroic salvation. The ocean waves of the Bay of Biscay are notoriously treacherous. The young king, with his poor eyesight, perhaps misjudged his strength, waded into the water and began to drown. And at that moment, Draga was there. What truly happened, we will never know. Was his life in real danger, or did he simply slip on the rocks and swallow some water? Did she save him by diving into the waves, or did she merely help him back to shore? The historical details are irrelevant. What matters is how Alexander himself perceived the event. To him, the lonely and unwanted, strange little boy, this beautiful, mature, and self-assured woman became a guardian angel. She didn't just help him, she saved him. In his mind, that moment was imprinted as a miracle. He, a king used by everyone, had for the first time met someone who showed him selfless care, and he was lost. Inexperienced in matters of the heart, he fell in love instantly, completely, and with all the force of a soul starved of affection. His keen interest did not escape the Queen Mother's notice. It was then that Natalia made her most serious mistake. Instead of nipping the budding romance in the bud, she approached the situation with calculation. Seeing her shy, insecure son, she decided that a light dalliance with a mature widow might even do him some good. "Let him have a little distraction," she reportedly said. In Draga, Natalia saw nothing more than a convenient mentor, a temporary companion who would help Alexander get comfortable in personal relationships and prepare him for an advantageous marriage to a princess. On her orders, her son was given chambers next to the lady-in-waiting's room, as if intentionally bringing them closer. She thought she was in control, that this would be a short holiday romance that would relieve boredom and give her son some manly experience. She could never have imagined that for Alexander, this was not entertainment. It was salvation. He, who had been torn between his domineering parents his entire life, found in Draga a mother, a lover, and a friend, everything he had been deprived of since childhood. He was bound to her not just by the body. His entire wounded soul had grown into hers. Queen Natalia, in her desire to arrange a small lesson in the ways of the heart for her son, had unwittingly orchestrated the meeting that would ultimately lead to the downfall of him, his dynasty, and plunge the entire kingdom into a period of great turmoil. The fuse had been lit, and now all that remained was to wait for the inevitable explosion. The love that had blossomed on the misty Atlantic shores could not remain a secret, warming only two hearts forever. It was too powerful, too all-consuming for the fragile and lonely king. Upon his return to Belgrade from Biarritz, Alexander brought back more than just pleasant memories. He brought Draga. At first, her appearance at court was handled with a degree of caution. She was not presented as the future queen, but rather as a confidant, a close friend of the monarch, a woman of impeccable manners and sharp wit whose counsel he valued. But the Serbian court was too small and its political life too tense for such a maneuver to go unnoticed for long. Very soon, everyone understood this was not just a friendship. Draga Mašin began to be invited to official receptions, afforded honors unbecoming of a former lady-in-waiting. In her presence, the king was transformed. His usual gloominess and shyness gave way to an uncharacteristic vivacity. He would search for her with his eyes in a crowd, hang on her every word. It soon became clear that her influence over the monarch was not limited to polite conversation. She became his chief advisor, his echo, his shadow. The decisions the king made increasingly reflected the thoughts and ambitions of his beloved. Belgrade held its breath in anxious anticipation. First came the whispers in the salons, then the scathing articles in opposition newspapers, and finally, open discontent in the circles of the aristocracy and the officer corps. Pandora's box was opened, and out crawled all the old rumors about the merry widow, magnified 100-fold and spiced with new, even more scandalous details. The first to try and stop the impending catastrophe was the king's father, the former monarch, Milan Obrenović. He, more than anyone, understood the fragility of their dynasty. He saw this affair not merely as a mésalliance, but as political suicide. His fury was not so much that of an offended father as that of an architect watching his heir prepare to dynamite the very building he had so painstakingly constructed. "Get that Mašin woman out of my sight," he demanded of his son in private, mincing no words. He called Draga an overripe fruit, a woman through whose bed half of Belgrade had passed. He screamed that his son was becoming a laughingstock for all of Europe, that this affair was destroying his reputation and undermining the very foundations of the throne. But his words, steeped in anger and contempt, had the opposite effect. Alexander, who had suffered his whole life from his father's domineering and dismissive attitude, saw these attacks not as concern, but as yet another attempt to control his life. The harder Milan pushed, the tighter Alexander clung to his love, which had now also become a symbol of his rebellion, of his personal freedom. And then, on July 8, 1900, the king struck back, a blow that shook Serbia to its core. On that day, he officially announced his engagement to Draga Mašin. This was not a quiet word in a private circle. It was a royal proclamation addressed to the entire nation. Patriarchal, conservative Belgrade, which might have tolerated much, was not prepared to accept this. A queen who was a widow, a woman 10 years older than the king, with such a reputation? It was unthinkable. It was an insult to the nation, a spit in the face of all tradition. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. The entire state, from the highest officials to the common people, rose up in outrage. The government was the first to fall. The entire cabinet of ministers, led by Prime Minister Vladan Đorđević, resigned in protest. It was an unprecedented political act, a clear signal that the ministers refused to take responsibility for their monarch's madness. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, in a last-ditch appeal to authority, went in person to the Metropolitan of Belgrade with a humiliating plea, not to give the royal couple his blessing, not to sanctify this shameful union in the eyes of the church. But the most powerful blow was struck by the Minister of Internal Affairs, George Gencic. Using his official position, he compiled an entire dossier on Draga. He published excerpts from 20 documents which he claimed irrefutably proved her numerous disreputable liaisons, including with married men. It was a public execution of her reputation. Gencic acted not as a gossip, but as a statesman convinced he was saving his country by exposing the true face of the future queen. From abroad came the curses of his parents. Milan, upon learning of the engagement, disowned his son and declared he would never again set foot on Serbian soil as long as that woman sat on the throne. He prophetically predicted that the marriage would be the end of the dynasty. But his mother's reaction was even more venomous. Queen Natalia, the very woman who had once pushed her son into Draga's arms, now unleashed the full force of her maternal wrath and public humiliation upon her former lady-in-waiting. She sent an open letter to all the European newspapers, calling Draga a woman of the lowest moral character, and in what was the most painful blow, stating that she was medically barren. It seemed the entire world had turned against the two lovers. But Alexander, surrounded by a wall of hatred and contempt, showed an unheard-of stubbornness. He exiled the most vocal opponents of his marriage, including Gencic, formed a new compliant government of his supporters, and began preparations for the wedding. But he understood that without international legitimacy, his marriage would remain nothing more than a scandalous affair, and so he made his riskiest geopolitical move. He turned to the Russian Empire. He knew that Russia had long been displeased with his father's pro-Austrian policies, and he offered St. Petersburg a deal. He, Alexander, would completely sever ties with Vienna and pivot Serbia's foreign policy 180 degrees towards Russia. In return, he asked for a small symbolic gesture of support. He asked the Russian Emperor Nicholas II to be his ceremonial godfather at the wedding. The calculation was cynical and precise. For the Romanovs, the personal life of the Serbian king was of no consequence. They couldn't care less who Alexander Obrenović held in his arms at night. But the chance to snatch Serbia from Austria-Hungary's sphere of influence without firing a single shot was too tempting to resist, and Nicholas II agreed. In August 1900, to the thunder of a cannon salute paid for by the Russian treasury and under the blessing of the Russian Tsar, Draga Mašin officially became Queen of Serbia. The wedding took place, the bridges were burned, and now the king and his queen would have to live in the besieged fortress they had built for themselves. The wedding bells fell silent, but the air in Belgrade remained electric. The ceremony, held against all odds, brought no peace. On the contrary, it only drew the battle lines deeper, dividing the nation. On one side stood the king and his adored Draga. On the other, nearly everyone else. The absence of the monarch's parents from the ceremony was not just a family scandal, but a public rupture for all to see. Milan's call from Vienna, in which he declared that Serbia was now a foreign land to him, was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. Even more devastating was the blow from his mother. Queen Natalia did not just condemn her son, she publicly disowned him. In her letters, which the European press eagerly published, she wrote that she regretted the day she had brought him into the world. For Alexander, who had spent his life searching for his mother's love, this was tantamount to a spiritual curse. But in his stubbornness and his love, he was unshakable. It seemed that the more the world pushed him away, the tighter he clung to the one person who, he believed, understood and accepted him. The entire world for him was now centered in the eyes of Queen Draga. She was his universe, his fortress, his justification, and soon it seemed this fortress had gained an unbreakable bastion. An event occurred that could have changed everything. Queen Draga announced she was expecting a child. The news swept through Serbia like a hurricane, instantly changing the balance of power. This was the trump card that could beat all of his opponent's hands. An heir, living, undeniable proof of the divine blessing upon their union. It was a chance to silence all the detractors who had screamed about the queen's infertility and the imminent end of the dynasty. Alexander was on cloud 9. This was not just the joy of a father-to-be. It was a triumph. He felt like a victor who had proven himself right before the entire world. His reaction was as boyishly enthusiastic as it was royally generous. He immediately declared a broad amnesty for political prisoners, including even some of those who had fiercely opposed his marriage. He wanted the entire nation to share in his elation. A grand ball for 800 guests was held at the palace, to which not only the aristocracy, but also common citizens were invited. It was a gesture of reconciliation, an attempt to show that the birth of an heir was a celebration for all of Serbia. Even the news of his father Milan's death in Vienna did not dim his joy. The former king had requested in his will to be buried abroad, thus denying his son forgiveness even in death. But Alexander, blinded by his happiness, took this too as a sign of fate. The last enemy of his love had left the stage. The culmination of this national euphoria was a gift from St. Petersburg. Emperor Nicholas II, true to his word and political interests, sent a truly czarist gift to Belgrade, a magnificent golden cradle for the future heir to the Serbian throne. This gesture was seen as the ultimate legitimization. The mighty Russian Empire itself was blessing this union and acknowledging its future. It seemed all curses were lifted and a bright future awaited the Obrenović dynasty. But the golden cradle remained empty. It became a silent, glittering monument to the greatest national shame. Months passed, but the queen's signs of pregnancy grew increasingly strange. Her condition raised questions. To dispel all doubts and prepare for the birth, the best gynecologists were summoned from Russia at Alexander's request, including the famous Dr. Gubarev from St. Petersburg. They arrived in Belgrade, conducted a thorough examination of the queen, and delivered a verdict that sounded like a death sentence for the monarchy's reputation. Draga had never been pregnant. Moreover, according to the medical council, she was physically incapable of having children. This was not a mistake. It was either a monstrous lie or a tragic delusion known to medicine as a phantom pregnancy, a rare psychosomatic condition where a woman desires a child so intensely that her body begins to mimic all the signs of carrying one. The scandal that erupted was like a nuclear bomb. The news instantly circled the globe. The world's leading newspapers, which only yesterday had written with tender sentiment about the impending arrival in the Serbian royal family, now competed in sarcasm. The front pages were adorned with caustic cartoons. Draga stuffing a pillow under her dress, Alexander rocking the empty golden cradle, the Serbian coat of arms with the inscription, "The Great National Illusion." Serbia became a universal laughingstock. The royal couple's reputation was not just damaged, it was destroyed, ground to dust, trampled into the mud. And the king? Did he fall into despair? Was he disillusioned with his wife? Number. His reaction was that of a man who had lost touch with reality. He flew into a rage and declared it was a conspiracy. He accused the Russian doctors of being bribed by his enemies to deliberately induce a miscarriage in his beloved wife. He seriously wanted to put them on trial and have them executed. Only the intervention of the Russian envoy, who explained in horror the consequences of such a move, saved the medics from his wrath. Draga's own role in this affair remains a mystery. Did she lie deliberately, desperately trying to strengthen her precarious position? Or was she herself a victim of her desperate desire and a body that had deceived her? We will never know. But for Alexander, it didn't matter. His love, which had passed through every trial, endured this one too. He believed her, he defended her, and he loved her, perhaps even more fiercely, seeing her not as a deceiver, but as a victim of cunning intrigues. But while the love between them remained intact, everything else crumbled. Nicholas II, feeling deceived and made a fool of, flatly canceled a previously planned visit by Alexander and Draga to Russia. Serbia found itself in complete international isolation, and the strange little king seemed to have lost his self-preservation instinct entirely. It was as if he had set himself the goal of turning absolutely everyone against him. Every move he made was a deliberate provocation, a challenge to public opinion. The elite cavalry regiment, named after his father, King Milan, was defiantly renamed the Queen Draga Cavalry Regiment. Draga's birthday was declared a national holiday, mandatory for nationwide celebration. But his most insane act was his meddling in the line of succession. Realizing they would have no children of their own, Alexander, pushed by Draga, began to seriously consider one of her brothers, Nicodice Lunjevica, as heir to the throne. This was the final straw. The Serbs could tolerate much, but they were not prepared to hand the throne to the queen's brothers, who were hated by the people for their greed, cruelty, and arrogance. The nation's patience snapped. In the barracks of the Belgrade garrison, the conspirators were already sharpening their sabers. The nation's patience was not just exhausted, it had turned into a dry powder keg with a lit fuse already held to it. The king's insane actions, his complete disregard for the interests of the state, and above all, the monstrous prospect of the hated Lunjevica brothers ascending the Serbian throne, all this made the tragedy inevitable. Deep within the Belgrade officer corps, among young patriotic military men who felt insulted to their core, the machinery of a conspiracy was set in motion. The heart of this movement was a secret organization that would later enter history under the sinister name the Black Hand. Its leader and chief ideologue was Captain Dragutin Dmitrievich, nicknamed Appius, a man of iron will, a fervent nationalist, convinced that any means were justified to save the motherland. He and his comrades did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as surgeons about to perform a painful, bloody, but vitally necessary operation to remove a cancerous tumor from the body of Serbia. The plot ripened over several months. Dozens of officers were involved, including some responsible for guarding the royal palace. The plan was simple and audacious. One night, they would infiltrate the monarch's residence and put an end to Alexander's rule and Draga's influence once and for all. The fateful date was set for May 29th, 1903, by the old calendar, the night when Serbian history was to take its most brutal and abrupt turn. In the days leading up to it, a heavy tension hung over Belgrade, unseen but felt by all. The royal couple, according to rumor, received anonymous warnings. They were advised to be cautious, not to trust their entourage. But Alexander, immersed in his own world where only he, his love, and his enemies existed, dismissed these rumors as yet another attempt to intimidate him. He believed in the loyalty of his guard, in the impregnability of his walls, in his lucky star. On the appointed night, a group of conspirators led by Apis entered the grounds of the old palace unopposed. The betrayal was total. The sentries of the royal guard either joined the attackers or simply offered no resistance. The conspirators spread through the dark corridors of the palace like avenging ghosts. A gruesome, methodical search began. They broke down doors, overturned furniture, and pierced tapestries and curtains with their bayonets. But the royal couple was nowhere to be found. For several hours, this terrifying game of hide-and-seek continued within the walls of the vast, empty house. The king and queen, awakened by the noise, had managed to hide in a secret dressing room attached to their bedroom. They stood there in complete darkness, listening to the search outside, their lives hanging by a thread. One can only imagine their terror, their despair, their last conversation in that cramped, dark space. Finally, one of the conspirators, noticing that the lock on the secret room's door looked unusual, realized where to find the fugitives. After several unanswered demands to surrender, the attackers blew the door open with dynamite. Alexander and Draga stood before their executioners. They were in their nightclothes, blinded by the light of lanterns, defenseless. And in that final, most terrible moment, Draga performed her one and only act that partially redeemed all her mistakes. According to eyewitnesses, seeing a weapon aimed at her husband, she stepped forward without hesitation and stood between him and the assassins, trying to shield him with her body. It was the final gesture of her desperate, all-consuming love. Their end was horrific. The fury of the attackers, which had been building for years, erupted in an orgy of brutality. The queen's body was later found to have 63 saber wounds and 2 bullet holes. The king had suffered 40 blows and 6 gunshots. They had no chance of survival. One thinks that for all their mistakes, for all their political blindness, they did not deserve such a conclusion. Their bodies, mutilated beyond recognition, were thrown from a second-floor balcony into the palace garden. Thus, in a single night, the Obrenović dynasty, which had ruled Serbia intermittently for nearly a century, ceased to exist. The victors immediately began to create their own version of history. Alexander was declared a mad tyrant, and Draga a depraved and fallen woman, a witch who had ruined the country. An elderly representative of the rival dynasty, Peter Karađorđević, who was living in exile in Geneva, was summoned to the throne. Europe shuddered in horror and disgust. The May coup was seen as an act of unprecedented barbarism. Great Britain and the Netherlands severed diplomatic relations with Serbia. Sanctions were imposed against the country. For many years, Serbia would be regarded as a wild, uncivilized land where political issues were settled with sabers and dynamite. But the most terrifying thing was that this bloody night in Belgrade was not an end, but a beginning. It triggered a chain reaction that, 11 years later, would lead the world to a global catastrophe. Having come to power, the Karageorgievich dynasty reoriented the country's entire policy towards Russia, which sharply exacerbated relations with neighboring Austria-Hungary. And the secret organization, the Black Hand, feeling its power and impunity, grew into a formidable shadow force, influencing all of Serbian politics. It was this organization that, 11 years later, would plan and carry out the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo. The shot fired by Gavrilo Princip, which became the formal pretext for the start of the First World War, was a direct echo of that May night. And it all began with her, with Draga, the wicked queen, the woman with a complicated past, hated by her entire country. All her life, she had sought love, recognition, and security, and found them in only one person. And that person, who loved her to his last breath, was him, her second husband, the last king of the Obrenovich dynasty, the strange little boy Alexander.